Hey everybody, Brad Geiger here once again, and we're going to continue talking about storytelling, and specifically today we're going to talk about conflict and narrative tension, which are key components of writing at its very finest. There really is no story without narrative tension, so it's really important that we take some time to understand it, to discuss it, and to find the different ways that we can use this concept to make our writing better. So let's start here. Let's talk about what is conflict.
Hi, this is Mr. Santo. Let's talk about conflict. Okay, you want to hear the most boring story in the world? It goes like this. Jimbo had a normal day. He went to school, hung out with his friends, came home, ate dinner, did some homework, and went to bed. The end. The reason that's so boring is because there's no conflict. You must have some kind of problem or conflict to have a story. The way I see it, there are 6 main kinds of narrative conflict. Character versus character, character versus self, character versus nature, character versus machine, character versus society, and character versus destiny. You can classify these into 2 categories, internal and external. Character versus self is internal because they take place within the character's head or heart. The rest are external because it's the characters in conflict with someone or something outside of themselves. In this video, I'm going to use a lot of movie examples because there's a better chance that more of my viewers will know the reference. The most basic kind of conflict is character versus character. That can be protagonist versus antagonist, or good guy against bad guy, Rey versus Kylo Ren, Optimus Prime versus Megatron, or Harry Potter versus Voldemort. But they don't necessarily have to be physically in conflict. They can be competing against one another. The movie Rush comes to mind, where there are rival race car drivers. It can be one character versus a group of people, like in Mean Girls, or one group versus another group, like Pitch Perfect. Also, it's best if your 2 characters are in a situation where they can't easily just get away from each other. This is what the author James Fry calls the crucible. They should be obliged in some way to continue being in conflict until it is resolved somehow. They could share a jail cell or a life raft or a spaceship. They could be in a marriage or trapped in a house, be in the same class at school, the same team, the same family, or be partners in some kind of business. But the key is that they can't easily just walk away from each other. Character versus self now is, in some ways, the most interesting kind of conflict. That's when the conflict takes place within the character's head and heart. It can be a character struggling with a decision, like between 2 options, stay or go, obey or disobey, this person or that one, right or wrong, or just trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, like in Hamlet. It can also be a struggle for control of the self, like someone fighting to stay sober despite his or her addiction or some irresistible temptation. In the case of a girlfriend or boyfriend being unfaithful to the other, you might think that's character versus character, but it's probably actually character versus self, because the real conflict is in the main character's response to the act of betrayal. And it could be either one, the betrayer or the person who was betrayed. Both sides of that conflict are potentially fascinating. Next, character versus nature. This is when a character or characters are in conflict with something in the natural world, like a natural disaster like a flood or an earthquake. They could be in opposition with a living animal like in Jaws or Jurassic Park. Think survival stories like Castaway or Hatchet. Or it could even be a story about a character's fight against a disease, like cancer, a killer bacteria or virus, like in the Hot Zone, where scientists are trying to contain an outbreak of the killer virus Ebola. That's nature too. Character versus machine is relatively new. Examples of this include a character fighting against robots, fighting against or simply in conflict with a computer. But it doesn't have to be real high-tech. Think of the hero from American folklore, John Henry, who competed against a steam drill. There was also a very good movie I saw in which a man was on a sinking boat in the middle of an ocean with no radio. Much of the movie is him trying and failing to keep the boat afloat. So, character versus machine can be in conflict between a person and any kind of technology. Stalled car, no cell signal in an emergency situation. This can be seen as a kind of character versus character, with the machine in the role of the antagonist. For character versus society, think of dystopias like The Hunger Games, The Handmaid's Tale, or Fahrenheit 451. This is where a character is in conflict with his or her society. Maybe it's an unjust system, like an example of prejudice or political oppression. Your character is going to be a nonconformist in some way, trying to beat the system. Sometimes these have happy endings, and sometimes they don't. Okay, this one is going to get a little cosmic, but character versus destiny is where a character is in conflict with some vast, invisible, and superhuman force, like the hand of fate, or destiny in Romeo and Juliet, or even God. Odysseus was in conflict with Poseidon. In Elie Wiesel's Holocaust memoir, Night, the main character, surrounded by unimaginable horrors, curses God. In the fantasy genre, it could be a person in conflict with a curse or the spirit world. A character might be in conflict with time itself or a streak of bad luck. Some might call this karma. I also think about characters in the Star Wars series struggling against the pull of the dark side. So, these are what I consider the 6 main kinds of conflict in stories. All stories contain some kind of conflict, but good stories usually contain more than one kind. A lot of the time, there's an external conflict and an internal one at the same time. Here are some time indexes so you can listen again to the parts you need re-explained. So there you are, 6 kinds of narrative conflict.
So depending on how you count it, there are 6, maybe 7 different types of conflict between, not between characters necessarily, but conflict in your writing. There could be a character versus themselves, right? It's an internal conflict. There can be a character versus a different character. That's another type of conflict, and a pretty common one, right? When we see 2 characters with different purposes, different wants and needs, that creates conflict. We can talk about a character versus society, right? This is a character that we see a lot of dystopian future type writing that basically boils down to character versus society. We can talk about character versus nature, right? If you're out on a boat and there's a big storm coming and there's no one around to rescue you, that story is going to revolve around character versus nature. There can be character versus machine, right? The old John Henry story who went up against the locomotive in the folk tales. And if you saw the recent Picard series on CBS All Access, there was a good deal of character versus machine in that series. We can also talk about character versus fate. And here's where I say sometimes 6, sometimes 7, because depending on who you're reading, depending on who you're listening to, sometimes they lump both of these into the same category. I think they're different enough that they deserve to be at least discussed separately. If you want to mentally put them in the same category, that of course is up to you. But there is character versus fate. Which is the person is fated or is maybe destined to do a certain thing, and that character doesn't want that to happen, and they're fighting against that destiny. That is a character versus fate type story, and of course, character versus supernatural. There are supernatural forces at work against this character, and that's where the conflict comes from. Conflict does not necessarily mean tension. Conflict does not equal narrative tension. Conflict is the beginnings of narrative tension, but it isn't. Let's not confuse conflict and narrative tension. They're 2 different things. Conflict is the beginning. It's where we start off from. Okay, that's where you've got characters or components, let's say, because sometimes, as we just saw, it's maybe a character versus nature or a character against destiny. So we've got components that are in opposition to one another, and they both have, again, different wants, different needs, different desired outcomes, and that is the conflict. But it's not necessarily narrative tension. Narrative tension takes conflict and exploits it. It makes it bigger. It does hyperbole to the conflict to try to make that conflict more interesting, and that's what narrative tension is all about: is making that making that conflict interesting. Okay, so let's not get confused. Conflict does not necessarily equate with narrative tension. So, having discussed conflict, which is pretty simple, right? It's things that are at odds with one another, either characters or components that are at odds. Let's talk about the real meaty subject here, and let's talk about narrative tension.
What makes a good horror story? Sure, you could throw in some hideous monsters, fountains of blood, and things jumping out from every corner. But as classic horror author H.P. Lovecraft wrote, the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And writers harness that fear not by revealing horrors, but by leaving the audience hanging in anticipation of them. That is, in a state of suspense. The most familiar examples of suspense come from horror films and mystery novels. What's inside the haunted mansion? Which of the dinner guests is the murderer? But suspense exists beyond these genres. Will the hero save the day? Will the couple get together in the end? And what is the dark secret that causes the main character so much pain? The key to suspense is that it sets up a question, or several, that the audience hopes to get an answer to, and delays that answer while maintaining their interest and keeping them guessing. So what are some techniques you can use to achieve this in your own writing? Limit the point of view. Instead of an omniscient narrator who can see and relay everything that happens, tell the story from the perspective of the characters. They may start off knowing just as little as the audience does, and as they learn more, so do we. Classic novels like Dracula, for example, are told through letters and diary entries where characters relate what they've experienced and fear what's to come. Next, choose the right setting and imagery. Old mansions or castles with winding halls and secret passageways suggest that disturbing things are being concealed. Nighttime fog and storms all play similar roles in limiting visibility and restricting characters' movements. That's why Victorian London is such a popular setting. And even ordinary places and objects can be made sinister, as in the Gothic novel Rebecca, where the flowers at the protagonist's new home are described as blood red. 3. Play with style and form. You can build suspense by carefully paying attention not just to what happens, but how it's conveyed and paced. Edgar Allan Poe conveys the mental state of the narrator in The Telltale Heart with fragmented sentences that break off suddenly. And other short declarative sentences in the story create a mix of breathless speed and weighty pauses. On the screen, Alfred Hitchcock's cinematography is known for its use of extended silences and shots of staircases to create a feeling of discomfort. 4. Use dramatic irony. You can't just keep the audience in the dark forever. Sometimes, suspense is best served by revealing key parts of the big secret to the audience, but not to the characters. This is a technique known as dramatic irony, where the mystery becomes not what will happen, but when and how the characters will learn. In the classic play Oedipus Rex, the title character is unaware that he has killed his own father and married his mother. But the audience knows, and watching Oedipus gradually learn the truth provides the story with its agonizing climax. And finally, the cliffhanger. Beware of overusing this one. Some consider it a cheap and easy trick, but it's hard to deny its effectiveness. This is where a chapter, episode, volume, or season cuts off right before something crucial is revealed, or in the midst of a dangerous situation with a slim chance of hope. The wait, whether moments or years, makes us imagine possibilities about what could happen next, building extra suspense. The awful thing is almost always averted, creating a sense of closure and emotional release. But that doesn't stop us from worrying and wondering the next time the protagonists face near certain disaster.
So you see, there are three main components to narrative tension. You've got anticipation, uncertainty, and investment. All right? And those are the three stages of building up narrative tension. There are different ways to create each component, and the way you mix them together will determine the flavor of the narrative tension in your book. Think of it like a stew. Stew always contains a liquid base, solid ingredients, and seasonings, but your choices as the cook determines whether it's an Irish stew or a Cajun gumbo. So you can use these different, you can use anticipation, uncertainty, and investment in different ways depending on what kind of story you want to write. So let's talk about the first part of narrative tension, anticipation. And it's really, really important. Anticipation makes all the difference in the world. For the reader to want to turn the page, they must believe that something interesting is going to happen on the next page. That sounds really dopey. That sounds like, why are you taking the time to explain this? But if you read a lot of amateur and pro-am storytelling, you'll see that it comes down to that very issue. We need to ensure the reader that something interesting is going to happen on the next page. And a lot of writers don't bother to do that. They get all caught up in going from A to B, from B to C, from C to D, that they forget that it's not going from A to B, it's going from A to B in an interesting way. Okay? So, anticipation. Your reader has to be assured that something interesting is going to happen on the next page. It doesn't matter about whether they're right or wrong about what that is going to be, as long as they're assured that it's going to be something interesting. They can make guesses, they can have all kinds of plots going on in their own minds, and they should, if you're doing a good job writing, their own imaginations should be spurred on by this. It doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong, just as long as they know that something interesting is going to happen. The only failure in writing is when a reader assumes nothing special will happen. Again, even if they're right or wrong, even if they turn the page and something amazing happens, the fact that you didn't set that up, the fact that you didn't set the stage for that, meant that they got bored and turned away before they could turn the page. That's why anticipation arises when the reader becomes aware of the possibilities. So let's take, for an example, a story that will center around the protagonist being caught in a forest fire. There are several ways you could make the reader aware of the possibility of a forest fire and thereby create anticipation. It could be directly. A car radio broadcasts a fire warning. It could be indirectly. The park ranger warns the protagonist to be careful with their campfire. It could rely upon common sense. The forest is described as dry, and the reader fills in the rest, right? You've got a hot forest and very dry conditions. It could be foreshadowing. The protagonist sees a neighbor building a bonfire from the same type of wood that grows in the forest that they'll be visiting. Though the reader anticipates something will happen, they must have a feeling of doubt or a lack of resolution. They may doubt their understanding of the situation or be unsure of the outcome. This compels them to continue reading to obtain closure. In other words, it's not so much that you need to set the stage for it, but you need to also set that stage for how is this going to be resolved. How is this going to happen? If you don't leave that hanging in the balance, again, you've failed in your opening steps, your opening gambit to creating narrative tension, and you risk that reader turning away in boredom. Okay, so let's talk about that component of anticipation a little bit more. This whole idea of the reader trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Let's take an example of a courtroom drama. Okay, something we've all seen on TV and in movies. The story follows the trial from the opening statements to the final verdict. Here are a few different ways to set up the story to create different types of uncertainty and narrative tension. You could do this. The reader knows whether the protagonist is guilty or not, but the facts of the case are compelling, and the reader does not know what the verdict will be. You could do this. The reader knows the protagonist is guilty and struggling with it internally, but the evidence is shaky, and the reader does not know whether the protagonist will admit their guilt. Here's another way of handling that one simple premise. The reader knows the protagonist is guilty, but does not know how or why the protagonist committed the murder. That's the most common type of murder mystery, right? A whodunit. That's Sherlock Holmes in a nutshell. You're given a very complicated case. It's impossible to have happened, and yet it does. And yet it did. And Sherlock knows how it happened. And you go along as this unfolds, and the amazement is in how he figured this out using nothing more than deductive reasoning. That's the whole narrative tension of a Sherlock Holmes style murder mystery, is that you know that you know it happened, but you don't know how it happened. Okay, here's another example of something you can do. The reader knows the protagonist is guilty and will be exposed in court, but does not know how the protagonist's friends and families will respond. In abstract terms, these examples show, in order, uncertainty about the outcome of the event, uncertainty about an internal struggle, uncertainty about a motivation or cause, and uncertainty about consequences. And those are just a few simple examples of something you could do with a courtroom drama. It is by no means a complete list. Okay, you can just one of my favorite examples here is a TV series that ran for decades called Columbo. All right, that took the classic murder mystery that we were just talking about and set it completely backwards. All of the stuff that you wait for the last page in a whodunit mystery, who did it, why did they do it, how did they do it, all of that is revealed in the opening 5 minutes of a Columbo movie. Okay, that's you know it. You know who, what, where, why, and how. You know everything. The narrative tension is set up when this bumbling detective comes in, who's kind of an everyman character, comes in and just starts picking at threads and unravels the whole thing. There's a lot of great narrative tension to be developed there, not only watching what's going to actually be the little Jenga block that brings the whole thing down, but there's an underlying theme of somebody who's very common, somebody who's at the base level, not somebody who's very elevated in society. Every one of the people that are murder committers, the bad persons in these stories, are usually rich, powerful, full of themselves people. He's always bringing down the rich and powerful. And that is another way that we see that narrative tension being built. We like to see somebody who's haughty being brought down, especially if it's by an everyday person.
One other thing. In regard to your practice of recording people's comments after the screening, what is that, like a question and answer period? I mean, the people in the audience, they raise their hands and they ask questions, and you stand up there on the stage and you answer them?
No, usually we meet in the lobby. We discuss the film there, and I record their comments. That's all.
Oh, you do it in the lobby?
Yes.
Oh, fine. Gee, now that's peculiar.
What is peculiar?
No, it's peculiar that you would walk into the lobby. I see a man that was lying on the floor, he just got shot in the middle of all that excitement. Turn on a tape recorder.
Well, did it occur to you that I might have turned the tape recorder on before I went into the lobby, before I ever saw the body? As a matter of fact, I think I turned it on directly after screening.
Well, that explains. Thank you very much.
So, having spoken about anticipation, let's talk about the next step of narrative tension, which is investment. A combination of anticipation and uncertainty may mildly arouse the reader's curiosity, but to create a strong narrative tension, the reader must also feel invested in the outcome. The most well-known form of investment is a positive identification with the protagonist, which leads the reader to want good outcomes for them. I always say, if you want a master's class in creating investment, check out the first 5 to 10 minutes of nearly any Disney or Pixar movie. All right, they've got it down to a science. They make you invest very, very quickly with that main character using a number of ways. Okay, you can take a look at the first 30, 60 seconds in the opening credits to Up, the Pixar movie Up. You can take a look at how they get you invested in that old man. And think about that too. It's one thing to be invested in somebody who's young and beautiful. It's another thing to become invested in somebody who's old and curmudgeonly. But Up did it masterfully. And you can take a look at this happening in movie after movie after movie. They really spend a lot of time. And if you want to delve into that, just go into your streaming service, and I'm sure you can find some Disney. I'm sure you can find some Pixar there. Go and watch some of these, and just watch the opening. Just watch the first 5 minutes with the mindset of how are they making me feel emotionally connected to this character. And there's all kinds of giveaways. Here's a great one. How do animals react to that character, right? When Snow White is singing in the forest and the bluebird lands on her finger, right? What does that tell us about that character? How do dogs react to the character? They use that in reverse too. A villain comes on, the dog always snarls at the villain, right? There's a number of ways. How do animals react? How do the townspeople react to Belle as she's singing that somewhat derisive song about them prancing through the French village? How do people react? How do animals react? And how do they interact with other people? Here's one you'll see all the time. Once you get this in your brain, you're going to start seeing it in movie after movie after movie. The character walks in and does a brief interaction with someone who you wouldn't expect them to have a relationship with, right? Maybe they're the person selling fruit on an apple cart. Maybe they're at a newsstand. Maybe they're just an ancillary character. And then they say something that lets you know that they're very invested in this person's life. Hey, Sid, how's the wife? Hey there, Clarence, how's your daughter doing? Is she just still doing those violin lessons? And the way that person then reacts to the protagonist, that's very, very important to how we interact with that character internally.
Annie had been studying for her master's in architecture for the past semester in Rome. I remember I was at work walking through the factory. I own a company called Sidekicks. We manufacture athletic shoes. Anyway, I remember how preoccupied I was that day.
I'm sorry, Mr. Banks.
My fault, Grace. Annie had never been that far away from home, and she was due back any minute. I couldn't wait to see the kid.
George, she landed.
My daughter had been studying abroad, been flying for 11 hours. I'm not wild about her being in the air. You have kids, Juan. You understand. It's better when they're on the ground.
Internally. We see them interacting with people that we don't expect them to have a relationship with, and they do, and now this must be a special person. So let's talk about investment a little bit more deeply and talk about some of the different types of investment. Investment could be intellectual or emotional. It could be a typical puzzle mystery like we've just been talking about. It's based on the reader's intellectual investment in discovering the solution rather than an emotional investment in a particular character. Investment could be positive or negative. For example, a revenge story is based on the reader's desire to see bad things happen to a hated character, rather than a desire to see good things happen to a beloved character. Directed at an idea, group, society, institution, or even an idea. Those are all kinds of different ways that we can see investment. A story of a political uprising might have both likable and unlikable characters on both sides, but the reader might be primarily invested in the outcome of the uprising itself and the political ideas under debate. Anytime the reader wants a specific outcome, they are invested. Okay, so let's look at a few ways that we can create tension throughout our storytelling.
Welcome to Writing Tips with children's author Ken Baker. Today we're going to talk about how to make stories more interesting to readers by increasing the story's level of tension. Conflict or tension is key to engaging a reader's interest. To keep the reader interested in your story from beginning to end, you need to build upon that tension throughout your story. A technique called the try-fail cycle is a great way to keep tension and reader interest growing. The basics of the try-fail cycle go something like this. The hero faces a problem or obstacle. Next, the hero attempts to overcome that problem or obstacle. The hero's first attempt fails, and the problem gets worse or becomes more difficult. The hero's second attempt fails too, and things get even worse. The situation seems hopeless. Against all odds, the hero's third attempt succeeds, and now all is well. Let's watch an example of how this works.
Help! There's an alligator in my oatmeal. I know. I'll trap it with sticky maple syrup. Ha ha! Take that! Oh no! It loves maple syrup. Slurp, slurp, slurp. Oh no! The syrup is making it grow bigger. I know. I'll blast it with whipped cream. Oh no! Now it's really mad. Help! What am I going to do now? Hey, what if Mr. Alligator just wants someone to play with? Hey, Mr. Alligator, meet my toy zebra. Ah, now they're BFFs forever.
The key to creating rising tension is that you don't want the protagonist to solve plot conflicts too quickly or too easily. That lessens the tension and reader's interest. On the other hand, if it takes too long for the protagonist to overcome the challenge, it can become tedious and lessen the tension and interest level as well. The try-fail cycle of 2 failed tries and a success on the third try provides a good balance for raising the conflict tension and interest level in your story. That's all for now.
Tension can manifest in many different ways. Okay? It can be an obviously aggressive move, right? That can manifest tension. It could be underlying jealousy, unresolved family issues, unspoken secrets. It could be a subtle yearning for better things to come when all hope seems lost. It can be romantic tension, manifest in many different ways. Antagonistic, torn between love and duty, torn between two love interests. It could be longing for the love or acceptance from a parent figure. Conversely, the danger side of this is creating low tension, right? When you've got page after page of low tension writing, again, you're risking losing that reader. What are the signs of low tension? Well, that could be dialogue with inane chit-chat, right? Meaningless conversations that don't move the plot, characters that don't deepen your understanding of those characters. Those kind of conversations can really kill your story. It could be inner dialogue that doesn't propel the story or deepen the character. It could be creating an easy out for your protagonist. This is a real problem. Some of us at our hearts are really nice. Right? And we don't like to see horrible things happen to people. But being a good writer, in the words of somebody, paraphrasing the old expression, means creating these characters that you adore and then chasing them up a tree and throwing stones at them. Okay? And the story is, how do they get back down? You've got to create these characters that you yourself as a writer, you're very emotionally invested in, and then concoct horrible things to happen. And that is a real problem with some people. They it's just not in their nature to be mean. And in the real world, that's of course what we would want in a person that we meet out on the street. In a writer, we want the opposite, at least in a fictional setting. And of course, like we talked about last week, a great way to kill your reader's interest in your story is an info dump. It's massive backstory, detail after detail after detail after detail. Frankly, we just watched Rise of Skywalker again, and they did that, that crawl that they have to do because it's iconic now. But reading the actual crawl, that info dump, ain't great. Ain't great. There were some crawls that New Hope had obviously the best crawl, but the Rise of Skywalker was not a great. It was kind of an info dump. And I sat there saying, okay, let's crawl that a little bit faster. Let's get to the pew pew part. That's what I'm here for. I'm here for the pew pew. How do you increase the tension in your writing? Donald Mass had a great has a great exercise that I really strongly recommend. He says, turn to any page in your writing and pick just a random line, just any line at random. Figure out a way to increase the tension in that moment. And then go to another page, pick another random line, and do the same. Once you've got the hang of it, go through your entire writing and pick lines and just randomly increase the tension. Once you, so again, that sounds real dumb. I'm going to take random moments and just increase the tension. Why would I do that? Because in doing that, like 5 or 6, 7 times, 20, 30 times, depending on how your brain works. Me, it took longer for it to sink in, but for you, probably 2 or 3 times. When you do this over and over and over again, you start to form patterns. You start to see things. You start to see, oh yeah, I can see that low tension writing walking up Broad Street. I can see it coming because I've done this a few times, and it's like, okay, I've done a specific exercise of increasing tension. Then when you've written your first draft and you're doing your read through, now these patterns emerge and you're able to say, okay, I need to do something with that sentence. I need to do something with that paragraph. I need to do something with that chapter. And that just leaves us to talk about the most important part of your narrative tension, and that is releasing that tension. Okay, releasing tension is what it's all about. You're building it, you're building it, you're building it, and you're releasing it. It's like I've told you any number of times. If you want to learn how to tell a good story, learn how to tell a joke well. Because it's the same thing. Drama or comedy, it's the same thing in the same mechanics that you're trying to do. You're setting up a situation, you're presenting conflict, you're building the tension, and then you're exploding it. You're popping it like a balloon, right? And any number of jokes that you can tell. I went to the doctor. He says, you've got cancer. I said, I think I want a second opinion. He says, okay, you got cancer and you're ugly. Old joke. But it shows exactly that same thing. Cancer, conflict, right? I want a second opinion. That's tension. There's a reason the doctor repeats the initial diagnosis. It isn't because you forgot it from 5 seconds ago. It's to further build the tension. And then you're ugly, of course, it is the tension breaker. Poof. Okay? As you know, I come from a comics background. If you want to see tension and release done beautifully, go to some of the go to a comic strip. You'll see it done. Go to a well done comic strip. Calvin and Hobbes, for example, is a tremendous example of this because Bill Watterson's writing and his art was right dead on. Okay, he really knew how to build tension in 3 panels and explode it in the 4th. All right, go to read any Calvin and Hobbes and just look at why Bill uses the words that he uses. You'll see there are very few. It's edited down to the bone. Editing is super important in building narrative tension, as we've talked about. Again, no info dumps, no low energy moments, no no moments of low impact dialogue. Right? Comic strips are great for this because you've only got so much room. You've only got so much time to make this happen. This is something that comic strips do well, and if you pay attention to the words that they're using, you can see it happen beautifully. This is also a great time to pull up whomever your favorite stand-up comedian is, because they do the same thing. They've got a limited amount of time. They know that attention span is short because they're playing in a nightclub most likely, right? And there's drinks being served, and if they're not holding that audience, they're going to lose the room. So go and listen to your favorite comedian, whomever that is, because whomever it is, doesn't matter who it is or where they come from, they're all using that same basic mechanics that you can use as a storyteller. Present a conflict, ramp it up, build it up, ratchet that tension as much as you can, and then explode it, right? Whether that's somebody who tends to do more of a long form storytelling type of thing, or whether that comedian is doing a one-liner where literally it's that tension and release happens in one sentence, it's still the same mechanics. Listen to your favorite comedian. In fact, I always tell people, listen to a comedy album, for example, twice, right in a row. Because now you've listened to the first time, you've laughed at all the funny parts. This is wonderful. This is great. Now listen to it again immediately thereafter. You know the punchlines that are coming. You're not going to be surprised by it anymore. Now you can listen to the mechanics at work, how that joke is being presented, how that tension is being ratcheted up until the very last moment, and then listen to how that punchline happens. Many times the word that conveys the biggest surprise in the punchline happens at the very end of the sentence. Why? Because that comedian or that comedy writer has been trained through years of doing it wrong, probably trained to say that surprise until the very, very end. I've got a video that I want to share with you that this lady does a much better job of talking about releasing that tension in the very end than I could. I found this video and I'm thrilled with it. So I'm going to let her have the last word, and then we're going to regroup at the very end for a little bit of housekeeping.
Hello, everybody. Today I'm talking about something super intense and epic and awesome, and that is the climax of a book. So first and foremost, what the hell is a climax? The climax of... Hello, everybody. Today I'm talking about something super intense and epic and awesome, and that is the climax of a book. So first and foremost, what the hell is a climax? The climax of a story is when the conflict of your plot is resolved or your protagonist's goal is achieved, and it usually occurs toward the end of the story. Now, I know all this sounds really simple, but it's not. If you've written an entire book surrounding this conflict, then that means resolving it needs to be really hard and really impactful. Because of this, the climax tends to be the most exciting part of the novel. Shit gets lit. Now, a lot of newbie writers struggle with this. They build up all this anticipation, and then suddenly they're at the climax and everything falls flat. So I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to write a strong climax. And I will try my absolute best to get through this whole video without making any orgasm jokes. It's not going to be easy, but sacrifices must be made. Number 1, give your protagonist a disadvantage. The climax is supposed to be intense, right? Nothing makes the climax more intense than when the protagonist is walking into the moment as the underdog. You want the reader to question whether or not the protagonist is going to succeed. If they feel like shit's in the bag, it's not going to be exciting. So have your protagonist enter the arena as the expected loser. And this can translate into all, if not most, fiction genres. If you're writing a war story, make sure the protagonist's army is significantly outnumbered. And if you're writing a love story and your protagonist is fighting to win his girl back, make sure she's already dating someone new. Putting your protagonist at a disadvantage is the key to ramping up the anticipation right from the start. And that's what you want. You want your reader interested in the climax from the moment it begins to the moment it ends. Number 2, your bad guy needs to be badder than ever. Got a bad guy? You probably do. In this case, your bad guy needs to be bad as fuck. I'm talking lethal. Even if you don't have a bad guy, you probably have an obstacle of some kind. Maybe it's disease, famine, the weather, whatever. Whatever the obstacle is, it needs to suck the absolute most at the climax. Now I know you might be thinking, but Jenna, if I make my bad guy unstoppable, how's my protagonist going to succeed? I don't know, figure it out. That's your job as a writer. But I'm telling you, there are few things more disappointing than when the reader gets to the climax expecting an epic showdown and the bad guy just curls up into the fetal position and says, "Don't hurt me." Theoretically, your protagonist has been scared of this bad guy or this obstacle for the entire book. So when they finally square off, the apprehension needs to be justified. If your reader is not intimidated by the bad guy or the obstacle, then you're doing it wrong. Number 3, your protagonist needs to almost fail. Remember how I said the bad guy needs to be badder than ever? I meant that. They need to be so bad, they almost win. What makes a climax especially memorable is if your protagonist nearly fails. This, of course, is assuming that you're writing the kind of climax where the protagonist eventually succeeds. And this is not just my opinion. There are tons of studies on storytelling that state that climaxes where the protagonist almost dies, or they almost lose their lover, are just more powerful and more enjoyable. Audiences respond to them. They like them so much more than climaxes where the protagonist instantly succeeds. And there's a good reason for this. Readers tend to prefer protagonists that work really, really hard. They want to see the struggle. They want to see the protagonist grow and push themselves. Perseverance is really inspiring. So having your protagonist almost lose it all and then suddenly come back swinging is going to make your reader super excited. They'll want to see them succeed, and then they'll be so satisfied when they finally do. Provided they do. You might be writing a story with a sad ending, in which case your reader will be devastated, but I imagine that's what you're going for. Us writers, we're evil. Number 4, surprise the reader. Not all books feature surprises or plot twists. I get that. But if you're going to surprise the reader, the climax is the place to do it. You know what makes a climax that much more exciting? When the reader's expecting a right hook, and instead you knee them in the balls. Okay, maybe that wasn't the best example. But dropping a bomb on your reader that they weren't expecting is going to take your climax to a whole new level. The best climaxes will have the reader gasping out loud or cussing or yelling "what" at their book. But Jenna, I don't know how to surprise my reader. There are a million ways you could surprise your reader. Come on, you're a writer. Get creative. Maybe the bad guy is finally revealed and it turns out she's the protagonist's lover. That shady bitch. Maybe the protagonist is trying to stop the evil sorcerer from attaining the sword of truth, and it turns out he had it all along. That shady bitch again. Now again, not all climaxes feature surprises, and that's okay, but you really ought to consider it, because a plot twist is guaranteed to take your climax to the next level. What the And number 5, make it climactic. There is nothing more disappointing than an anticlimactic climax. It's the climax. It's the most anticipated part of the book. Pull out the big guns. Get shit firing off. It's the climax. The climax doesn't have to be the reader's favorite part of the book, but it does need to be the most intense. A good rule of thumb is to look back at other exciting moments in your novel and try to surpass them, because your climax should reign supreme in that department. This is the moment everyone's been waiting for, so you gotta deliver. Now, I shouldn't have to tell you that the climax needs to be climactic, because they're basically the same word. But a lot of newbie writers miss this step. They finish off the book all nice and easy, and the reader's sitting there going, "That's it? I read this whole book for that?" Don't make the reader feel like they wasted time on your book. Melt their brains. Leave them wanting more. So that's all I got for you today. The climax is one of the most important parts parts of your novel, if not the most important part, so you really gotta sell it. At the end of the day, the key is to put the odds against your protagonist and make them work really, really hard to achieve whatever goal they're trying to achieve. This is going to keep your reader on their toes and rooting for the protagonist's success.
All right, so that's our discussion of tension and release. Narrative tension, climax, and conflict. All those things that you can use as a storyteller to make your stories keep your readers' interest. Make them, have you ever, if you've had the experience of reading a book and somebody says, how do you like that book? And you say, oh, it's a real page turner. I couldn't put it down. I told my son the other day, I said, I read this great book about glue. I couldn't put it down. If you've ever had that kind of experience where you are, you can't put the book down. You're reading until 3 o'clock in the morning because you literally can't put it down. Go back and watch the mechanics of how that writer did it. That writer did that through using these concepts of narrative tension and through building, getting you invested, and then finally releasing that tension. That's how they kept you reading that book when you were supposed to be going to sleep. Okay, this is how you can use that to improve your own writing. Now, again, I'm going to vamp a little bit here at the end. If you're here for the premiere, that means this is a great time to hit the chat and ask any questions you may have. I believe our 2 assignments at this point the deadlines have passed. So if you haven't gotten those in, please get those in very, very quickly. I'm speaking about the Dorothy Canfield assignment and the Walter Ong on orality assignment. Both of those, the due dates have passed, but listen, the key word this semester is flexible. We are going to be flexible. If you haven't gotten those in, get them in quick, okay, please. Now, the only thing hanging for the semester is for you to write a story. And again, this is going to be very, very simple. And you've got an email with all of the details. But the basic overview is you could write me a story. You could do a graphic novel type of presentation that presents your entire story. Has to be at least 20 panels. I always say at least 20 panels because I've been doing graphic novels for a long, long time. I've been doing comics for 20 years. I could not do an entire story in 20 panels. I don't know how I would do it. Okay? I've got to have a minimum there. So 20 is the minimum. It used to be 10. And I saw the absolute crap that was being turned in 10 panels. Because if I say the minimum is 10, I'm going to get 10 panels. I'm going to encourage you to do more than 20 panels. Do the number of panels that it's going to take to tell your story. But the minimum is 20. Do me a comic. That's the second iteration. You could do a story, or you could do a comic with at least 20 panels, or you could do what I'm doing. Point your phone or your a video recorder at your face and tell your story, and then send me the video. You can do it as close to an oral performance as you can using technology. That would be more than okay. So one of those 3 ways. It's due, I believe, on the last day of the semester. It's due, I think, in that first week of May. Okay, check your email for the actual due date. But you got the initial notification of this back in March. So I went back and actually counted. You will have had 45 days before this thing is due. And because of the requirements that I have as an instructor here, I've got to turn in your final grades relatively quickly after the end of the semester. So I'm telling you, I've been very flexible on these other assignments because of the coronavirus pandemic. I will not be able to be as flexible for this final project. That one you're going to have to get in on the last day of the semester and no later, because I won't be able to accept them after that. They want final grades very quickly. So I think 45 days is enough time to do that. Obviously, if you have any concerns about that, if you don't think 45 days is enough for you to write this story, or if you don't think that maybe you've got some other issues, listen, we're going to work it all out. We're going to do our best within the framework of what the semester is to to make everything happen. That's got to happen. So your number one instruction from me is not to worry. We're going to get this done. Again, if you have any questions, hit me in the chat. You've got plenty of time before the end of the video. You can always email me if you've got some questions or concerns. I always respond to my emails. But that's really where we're heading. We've got a couple more video lectures that we're going to do. I still have some things I want to talk to you folks about. There are still lots of topics that I'd like to cover in regards to storytelling, so that I make sure that I'm doing my best to present this topic to you as well as I possibly can in this video environment. But again, if you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. And then I'm just going to say this. Thank you so much for showing up to yet another video lecture. This was a great one. Narrative conflict, narrative tension, rather, is one of my favorite topics. There's a ton that we can explore there, and I think this was a good one. But most of all, my thoughts for you are to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay creative. We'll see you next week.